Member, and can I say, you know, the process of legislation is so difficult, tedious, and time-consuming in this country. And people tell me it's the same the world through, but I cannot believe it.
No, that is not all true. We have seen legislation come to this parliament in one day and pass. So it's not a generic problem. It's a selective one.
Well, in the case of Twin Peaks, you know, to start from scratch and to build a market conduct and customer protection legislation, because we have no real history of it, and we don't have a strong foundation starting from, we've had to sit and craft that. And then it has to go to this committee and that committee and back and to the AG. And we have spent a year, remember, a year we have spent trying to get this legislation to the level of cabinet. And we are hopeful that it will get to cabinet in the next few weeks.
Governor, I hear you, but I've been here long enough to know that the speed of legislation depends on the urgency attached to it. We have passed financial legislation at bold speed in this House. So legislations will take long, yes, depending on the urgency that is attached to it.
And maybe the complexity too.
And you know, complexities, yes. But when we have complex problems, we delegate the resources, human and otherwise, and in many instances we also import the expertise when they are not here because of the urgency and importance that we attach to it.
Member, can I say, I absolutely agree with you. And it's not as if we are sitting with our hands tied. We are trying to, as we say, practice Twin Peaks. So all that work that we did with the ATMs recently, for which I know you feel personally connected to, and for good reason, has been done outside of our legislative capacity. We have sat with the banks and said, although we don't have the right to tell you these things, let us work out some standards that are more acceptable to the public and which can serve them better. And that is how we got the recent ATM standards done. So even as we wait for the legislation to be implemented, we are practicing it in reality. And many of the suggestions that have been made here are suggestions that we can go to the banks and start to say to them, can we not address some of these issues? And we will. We're happy to.
I'm going to delay or defer comment on the standards and the promulgation of it since we're dealing with it in the second phase. But to come back to the losses issue. You know, Dr. Lewis, I listened to you addressing the whole duty of care provision alluded to by my colleague. But it seems like it's a very prescribed qualification attached to how far do you go in respect of the obligations of the financial institutions. Because in my layman's term, you are more expert than I am on these matters. When I read the legislation, which is in clear layman's term, in the interest of the licensee and for the protection of the depositors' funds. And when I listen to the comments by Deputy Commissioner of Police, I don't know if you become comfortable, Dr. Lewis, that the financial institutions that you have oversight over, if they are taking sufficient steps to ameliorate the problem that he alluded to. I really don't think so. And, you know, I come back about the ATM thing and the standards and adherence to it. Even the ABM standards, as you say, in the absence of legislation, when people are suffering out there with the machine, they could have done what has been done in the absence of legislation that only came about because of a parliamentary mandate. So the point I'm trying to make, Governor, is that left on their own, they do the least. They do the least. They don't exert themselves, in my mind, and I think in the public's mind, sufficiently when it comes to protecting the customers. And we heard what the commissioner said. When they report, they say, go and report it to the police. That's what the response is to the banks. Because when you go report it to the police, I don't have anything to investigate. You lose your money, but let the police deal with it. That is the kind of laziness that I referred to in the past as it relates to protecting the customers. People are experienced, for those reported to the JCF, over how many millions, Commissioner? $301 million. And look at the recent data between January and now in the report, there's about 98 reports to now compared to 178 and 79 the year before. We're more than half. At just 4 months in the year, if I was to make a correlation between number of reports and monetary loss, it's a significant amount. It's increasing. And then they say, let's go and report it to the police. That is not sufficient. There must be some obligation, Dr. Lewis, for them to put in place and somebody to make sure that they are putting these things in place rather than just recommend it to them in a meeting. It's good customer relationship for you to do these. And so if they don't do it, so what? You say you're a naughty boy and they just continue doing what they are doing. But while they are continuing what they are doing, people are losing their hard-earned money. That is the consequence of it. And I really don't believe, Dr. Lewis, that with your circumscribed qualification of duty of care, that there is any impetus to really cause them to do it. The record is there. Left on their own, they do the least. And people suffer. So I want more from you. And what I'm disappointed about the governor, every time that the BOJ needs regulatory provision, needs legislative provision, you refer to some of them that is complex and takes some time, and being in government ourselves, we rely, ministers and government rely on regulators to keep them abreast of what is happening in the sector that they regulate, not just from an informational standpoint, but to promulgate the necessary regulation and legislation and amendments. We do many amendments to acts in the parliament routinely to enable the regulator to do their job effectively in protecting the public's interest. The JCF does that in their field of law enforcement. So we have a lot of bills and acts that we have to be amended from time to time. You out there interacting with these institutions, knowing what their experience is, you must be knocking on our doors, we legislators, to provide legislative strengthening where they are weak, provide new legislation where they are absent, in order to fulfill your duty of protecting the public. And that is my real pain, Governor, is that the Bank of Jamaica is not asserting itself as a regulator of these institutions in ensuring that they protect the public. We don't have anybody else to go to until Twin Peaks is in place. What happened between now and then? We die? So, tell us what we need to do in specific terms. If it's a one-page legislation, even an interim legislation, we pass interim legislations from time to time because we can't wait until we get a perfect legislation. But there's an immediate problem to be resolved. And we enact those kinds of legislation from time to time. Why is it that we can't enact some interim legislation to protect the depositors until the perfect legislation, the complex legislation is finalized? That is what the public is impatient about, Dr. Lewis. We don't have anybody else to go to, Only you we have. We can't go to the banks because we see what they do. So, no, we can do it for you. That's what we are here for. We are here to strengthen your hand, to let you serve the public more effectively. That's our job. When we fall short in doing that, lick us over the head and tell the public that we are derelict. Tell the public that the legislators are tardy in doing what needs to be done. To the credit of the JSF, they do that. They come to Parliament from time to time and tell us where the legislation we have is weak and what we need to do. I've had to deal with them in other committees of Parliament. They do that, and I welcome that. You are our eyes on the ground. You are our experts. We are not. So we really, really want you. Don't let perfection be the enemy of good governor. Don't sit and wait for a perfect legislation to be promulgated before something is done to ease the pain until the cure comes.
We're going to get a response from the BOG.
The only thing I can say is that I hear you, and the passion is clear. We don't have a connection to Parliament. We work through our minister. I know that he's very keenly aware of the issue. I don't know what else is in the pipeline going to cabinet, but we have people working full-time on trying to get stuff to cabinet. And I don't know that we can do any more than that.
Your pathway is not only to the minister. The Parliament has a standing finance committee meeting, right, where the agencies come, number one. There is the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, right? That gives you a direct pathway to the Parliament. Your pathway is not only to the minister. Your pathway, because you're an institution. The Bank of Jamaica is constituted through a legislation of this Parliament, not a legislation of the Ministry of Finance or the Minister of Finance. To the Parliament of Jamaica, where all 63 of us sit, including the Minister of Finance. There is an ongoing pathway. This committee is one such pathway. As many other entities will do, they will contact the committees to investigate in matters relating to them so that they can get support. And what we can do at the committee, we'll discuss it after, is to make a periodic engagement with the Bank of Jamaica to see if there's anything they need us to do. Just a periodic meeting to update, tell us where there's legislative deficiencies, where there are regulatory deficiencies, and where you need help. So we can help because we are responsible to the country at large. All of us. Committees of Parliament work on behalf of the full House. We don't work on behalf of our individual selves, but we work on behalf of the full House of the Parliament, which makes us accountable to the people on a whole, on both sides of the political fence.
To be clear, each year, actually semi-annually, banks report to us their fees. And those submissions, we review them. There's no bank that charges fees on dormant accounts, right? There's no bank. I think that was a practice that prevailed up to 2018.
Oh, you mean no longer?
No, yes. So I'm reporting the current. So up to 2018, it was a practice that prevailed. There is no bank that engages in charging fees on dormant accounts, and that's the report that we have up to December of 2023. So that's a practice that they have resolved from.
I'm glad my colleague raised that about the dormancy fee. You know, Dr. Lewis, why they stop and when they stop. Because I'd publicly threatened to sue them under the same duty of care provision. And within 2 weeks, all of them suspended the dormancy fee charge. But for me, the problem doesn't end there, because billions of dollars were collected of those dormancy fee. And then my question to you, Governor, where someone puts the money in the bank and the bank deduct the charge and bring their account to zero and minus amounts, which have happened when they apply the dormancy fee. First question is the charging of the dormancy a breach of the act from the BOJ standpoint? Because I have not heard, Governor, the BOJ made a pronouncement on the legality of the dormancy fee as it exists in the law. And therefore, as a general principle, I am now submitting for the BOJ to advise or to indicate if the charging of dormancy fee constitute a breach of Section 36. That's one. Two, if it is a breach of Section 36, though ceased in 2018, they would be illegally collected. That's a logical deduction. It's a breach of the law. And if it is a breach of the law, and it was illegally collected, what will be the recourse of the BOJ for those monies collected illegally? Because if I collect something from anybody illegally, Commissioner is going to lock me up. If I take something from somebody in breach of the law, he's going to prefer a charge. Whether larceny or whatever the description is, because I would have collected it illegally. So I am submitting to you now, Governor, for the BOJ, it was, I said, one, prefer a legal opinion internally, and I would submit that the most responsible thing to do, and I thought the BOJ would have done it, is to seek a judicial review, to let the court pronounce of it if you have internal doubts, uncertainty, given the impact of it, both in terms of the scope of the impact across the country and the quantum of the impact. Because if it is illegal, they would have robbed the customers. Literally robbed them. Because they would have broken the law to have collected that money. So the BOJ has a duty to ensure that fees that are collected are within the bounds of the law. So I'm going to ask you to do that. You have an internal legal department to pronounce on it, and I'll submit that you need to even go further. Because one can easily deduct that the legal internal advice might be compromised for reasons which I won't elaborate on now, right? And so I believe the appropriate thing is to get from the Attorney General's chamber an opinion on the collecting of the dormancy fee against the provision of the existing law that prevailed at the time and up to, well, not up to, still continue under the Banking Services Act. So that is one. Now, I lost my train of thought on the second part, but I'll come back to it. But it related to, and I'm happy that my colleague here raised that. So those are two specific things. And I would like you to tell us, Governor, about how long from now we can get that response. Another week, another or so.
Well, certainly a response from our internal counsel, yeah. A week is not too long, no.
Okay. So you could just submit that to the clerk. But the other point I missed, I wanted to, Chairman, the point that member Hilton raised about the bank saying that the risk of the internal theft. A former banker who is a senior officer in one of our national institutions, when we had the deliberations in here and the banks raised that point, called me, and just 2 days ago he called me back. Right? To say that in the bank that he used to work, NCB, the protocol that exists is that for dormant account, they are closed and no member of staff except senior officer can access a dormant account. It's locked. No teller, no junior officer can enter. They have a system internally that prohibits only prescribed persons can enter into dormant accounts. So this argument about being vulnerable to internal theft, he laughed at it because in his own experience at the time in NCB, it couldn't happen and it don't happen. And Dr. Lewis, what really is distressing and unfortunate is that the banks don't seem to have much regard for, you talk about professional reputation, institutional reputation. They have destroyed their reputation by their practices. They have destroyed their reputation by what they failed to do, which is unfortunate because it will help us as a country. Because we need to have a sound banking system, not only sound from your prudential oversight, but we want to have a banking system that the world can feel comfortable to come in. We want investors to come here. We want people who own money to come and believe that the banks in Jamaica are reputable, honest people, respecting people, trustworthy people. But you go to survey the public out there, they equate them to scammers. It's not because of their own, the public's doing, their own doing and failure to do. So this crap argument about internal theft, why the dormant account is being lost, is an insult to any first grader's intelligence. And you must not allow them to proffer those kind of arguments and get away with it. Yes, Dr. Lewis, you must not. You are the supervisor.
The standards do cover issues around cash availability. They do address issues around customer redress, in particular in the area of the performance of the ABM. And recall that this is all within the context of the Code of Conduct, which has obligations for the DTI. What does all of that mean in English? If a customer goes to our ABM and it doesn't dispense what they had requested, the bank has an obligation under the Code of Conduct to do an investigation. That investigation can be conducted by the internal audit of the bank that can verify whether or not there was an issue with the machine or whether or not there was some sort of incorrect action on the part of the customer that was engaging with the ABM. Under the standard, they do have requirements to have video cameras in the ABM that can be used in that investigation. That footage should be able to be verifiable. And the only thing that's not to be caught by the video footage is the actual PIN entry. But everything else about the transaction should be caught on the video. And things like seeing whether or not the customer was actually counting cash is a good, in that particular instance, is a good check. Because if the customer is saying, I did not receive any money, then the question would be, why were you counting cash? No, the complaint could be that it didn't give me the right amount, and that's a legitimate concern. And so it would be then incumbent on the bank to check. The bank knows how much cash was put in the system in the morning, and the bank, just like a teller, knows you can compute how much funds are in the machine at the end of the day. And therefore, if you look at all the debits and all the credits, and the bank has, the ABM has more cash in it relative to all its deposits and its payouts, then you can determine that the customer, in fact, did not receive the cash. So the code of conduct is the first port of call. The customer is to write to the DTI to say that I had this incident, this is what happened. The bank has an obligation to, the commercial bank has an obligation to investigate that complaint and to make the necessary redress. If the customer is still dissatisfied, the customer has the right to write to the Bank of Jamaica, and we have an email address, customer.complaints@boj.org.jm, and we evaluate all of those complaints. We log it into a database. There's a team, and the only thing that team does is read the complaints that come to us, and then we write to the DTI. The DTI, having investigated it once more, coming to a conclusion that's not favorable to the customer still has the right to go to the police. In the standard that we issued, we required that the DTI holds the video footage for 180 days. How did we come up to that number? We consulted with the banks, we consulted with MOCA, we consulted with the JCF to determine what's a reasonable time within which an investigation can be done and which video evidence, if necessary, can be carried to court. So it can be entered into evidence whether against the favor of the bank or whether against the favor of the customer. So we gave enough time so that the investigation having been caused to be started, that can be entered into as part of the matter to come to a determination. So there are several ports of call in relation to that particular specific matter where the customer has mechanisms for redress. And I have certainly presided over complaints where the customer is compensated. So it doesn't mean it's happening every time, but I certainly have viewed instances where the bank, having done the investigation, realizes that it is at fault and the customer is compensated. So that's broadly the framework that exists currently and is supported by the guideline that was issued on April 3rd.
Okay, we have about 2 more questions. Member Jackson and then Molan.
I have
2 more.
3 specific questions, team. But you know, Dr. Lewis, when I listen to your preamble about the standards and the compliance and voluntary compliance and the reputation that the banks want to preserve while through moral suasion they will adhere. You know, you saw me smiling. I said, boy, I'm not saying that you're being utopian, because given the experience of the banks and their practices, it want to border on being utopian, which brings into question the whole issue of the absence of sanction. Commissioner will tell you, you know, somebody that have a reputation of certain practice, they don't hold out so much hope that they're going to voluntarily comply, you know. They rely on enforcement because their reputation speaks very loud. That said, I know that in the standards promulgated, you have a 9-month period for compliance for all the stipulations in it. And I take it that different provisions, and by the way, I believe that the provisions, the areas covered, is pretty comprehensive. Generally, I must proffer that to you. I was heartened when I read the depth of the provision. And so my comments now is not a wholesale condemnation, but some areas which I think is critical to give real meaning to what is here. So you have a 9-month compliance period for all of these provisions. Some is smaller, some is more major. So, Governor, I would believe that you would categorize the different provisions. This one or these within the next month. These within the next 2 months. For some that you need infrastructure upgrading or changing, which will take some time for procurement and all of those things, they would go at the longest period. But you lump all of them together. And so long as they are up to this 8.5 months, if they do nothing, they would not in breach of these standards. Almost 1 year to do nothing. And you could just easily put them in groupings and give specific timelines for those. You leave them for almost 1 year that they could possibly do nothing and only seek to comply at the 11th hour. So I am submitting that you recalibrate the timeline for these so that we can have immediate, where possible, compliance in some of those quote-unquote low-hanging fruits. The second one, you said that there are no legal authority to impose pecuniary penalties. Now, my question in that regard, team, are there any laws prohibiting setting those financial penalties? And if so, what are those provisions in law that prohibits you? That's on the first point. And the second point, if there is no legal prohibition, well, if there's none, why not? But in where you need legal strengthening or legal groundings to impose that, have you made such requests to the Minister of Finance to bring them to Parliament to give you those teeth, so to speak? Where you need law to impose financial penalty, where there is the requirement for legal strengthening, have you made any such submissions? And if you have not, when will you advance those? Because in the same way that we pass constitutional amendment here in 1 day, I assure you that my colleagues on both sides of the House will come even at midnight and pass a law to strengthen your ability to impose financial penalty for breach of them, because they want the protection. The people want the protection. So that is the second of the three that I want to. Well, it is two in the last one I give, where there is absence of legal. If there is any legal prohibition, yes or no, and two, if there is the need for any, have you advanced any to the BOJ, to the Ministry of Finance? Sorry.
Thank you for those questions. Let's start with the issue of whether or not there's anything that prohibits the central bank from issuing sanctions. I'm not the legal expert, but I don't believe there's anything that prohibits us. I think the issue is that if the bank issues sanctions, those sanctions cannot be ultra-virus its principal act, because, of course, the sanctionee, the person being sanctioned, always as a citizen or a legal person has the right to redress in court. So if the matter is contested, we would want to make sure that we are on strong footing, because of course we also have our reputations as supervisors, as regulators. So we wouldn't want to be entering into a matter where we suspect that if it is challenged in the court of law, that we would be found wanting because we acted ultra vires our law. So I think that's the reason why you'd want a law that explicitly allows you to issue sanctions is to eliminate legal uncertainty should you be challenged. We have used moral suasion to get the guidelines that we have, and we're using the mechanism of public disclosure as an incentivizing impetus to encourage banks to conform to what we want. And the anticipation is that once the legal framework for Twin Peaks with an authority, with the mandate so to do, has that, then these guidelines would then be converted into regulations. So the work we're doing now, and we've started with the ABMs, as the governor would have mentioned, we're going to be moving to other matters, is to then have everything in black and white, such that it can then very quickly be able to be converted into regulations, and the necessary sanctioning frameworks under that regulation would then take effect. So we're building the road, driving on it, and trying to make sure that we reach a destination that I think we're all anxious to reach in the shortest possible time, but in a time that ensures that the framework hangs together in a very internally consistent way. Nobody's going to benefit if there are obvious weaknesses in the framework that are subject to legal challenge. Nobody wins. I don't think anybody in that environment wins, and that's the essential reason for the approach that we have taken. I know it doesn't address all of your concerns.
No, just for clarification. When I ask if there is any legal prohibition, implicitly is that legal prohibition that would not make you legally vulnerable. You were pointing out about it being ultra vires, etc. I was asking straight if you could not do it within the legal framework that is existing. And I would not suggest that you do anything that will make you legally vulnerable or to cause any of them to come back at you, so to speak.
Sure.
Put it in simple terms. And then the corollary to that was that in the absence of that, have you made submissions for that on a fast-track basis? Or is it being left to the Twin Peak regime that was mentioned, was made of earlier on? So that is specifically what I want to get to. Is there an absence of legislative provision that will allow you to impose financial penalty in the first instance? Mm-hmm. And if that is the case, that there is an absence of legislation, are you seeking to fast-track the promulgation of such?
Yeah, so the answer to the first question directly is that there is no legal overarching framework to allow us to issue sanctions in relation to consumer protection matters. For us to issue sanctions under the Banking Services Act, we have to be able to demonstrate that it is a matter that would impact on the safety and soundness of a financial institution. So, for example, in the case of ABMs, we'd have to demonstrate that at service levels of 70% of all your ABMs, as a licensee, you are no longer compliant with your obligation to issue currency, for example. And so that's the measure, but that's not a measure of excellence, which is what consumer protection is about. Consumer protection is about performance at 99% and 100%. It's not about thought processes where there's still some amount of service deliverable, but it's not a good customer experience. So the frameworks, there's incongruence between the two frameworks, between what we would like to have and what our legal framework really allows. I don't know if that is as clear as possible. In relation to the second matter, in order to treat with that, because it's not just a causal absence, it's a fundamental absence. Because of that, there needs to be a legislative framework in primary law, right, that would be needed to be established, and that we're proposing would land with Twin Peaks. And you can't do subsidiary legislation before primary legislation. You have to do primary legislation and then support it by subsidiary. So the law, your act, will always supersede your regulations, which always supersede your standards, which will always supersede your guidance, and so on and so forth. And that's it. And then you have moral suasion, which is the weakest part of your artillery, so to speak. So that's essentially the state of play. I don't know if that
There was a third one about the 9 months.
Yes, go ahead.
Right, thanks. Member, perhaps in retrospect, I mean, we could have tried to calibrate specific timelines for each. But just to emphasize the intention, and certainly in our discussions with the banks and the commitments of the bank, the idea is not to wait until 9 months to have everything in place. The intention is to ensure that we actually begin to see some progress on each of these as soon as possible. So perhaps we could have imposed.
No, will you, if it can? You said it was as what the intention was.
Yeah,
if it can be, why not?
We'll consider it, and we'll go back to the banks and consult with them on it. But the bottom line is that...
But Doc, in the process of the consultation to have brought these about, wouldn't that bit of information would have been procured in terms of each of them and how long they would take to institute them?
Right. No,
No, they have to, no, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. So let me just clarify the process. So typically with standards or guidelines, we will sit with a committee. In this particular instance, it was a subcommittee of the Bank of Jamaica, the supervisory arm, and the subcommittee members from the Financial Services Commission, who we are anticipating would eventually take on the full remit of consumer protection and market conduct. We, as part of all our processes, we would then share that draft with the JBA and all its members. We would get comments. We would review those comments. We sat with experts from other jurisdictions who understand and have implemented consumer protection frameworks, got their advice, went back to the banks, and determined. Our focus, admittedly, was on the content of the guideline, to make sure that it was comprehensive, to make sure that it treated with the mischief that we've been experiencing as a country in relation to cash availability and so on. So it's a very wide-ranging standard. Admittedly, when we went through it, it was determined that because it's so far-reaching and it's affecting a wide cross-section of the activities of the bank, that we'd want to give them enough time so that they don't feel that we're doing a gotcha framework where you say, here's the rule, and then tomorrow morning you come and you say, you're in compliance. You're not in compliance, and therefore, and this is a standard part of what we do. There's always a transitional period, whether it is something to do with capital or it's a cyber guideline, whatever. There is a transitional period. I think we could have done timelines per aspect of it. That's something that we could have done. It's something that we can go back to them and have the discussions. I think where we are now, however, is that each DTI needs to submit to us their action plan to tell us how they plan to meet the obligations that come under these guidelines. And we look at each of those plans individually, because what may be very straightforward to do from one bank who just has 10 ABMs may not be straightforward for a bank that has 250. And so we have to bear in mind that when it comes to compliance, it's not a one-size-fits-all. For some, one provision in terms of making sure that their facilities are friendly to persons who are physically disabled. That provision can be made within 2 months. For another, it may take a much longer period of time.
If I may,
so
now,
that was the thought process. Let me just finish with one last thing. So each under the Banking Services Act, we do not prescribe the business model of the bank. What we say is that regardless of your business model, you need to meet these criteria: governance, how you manage, how you report to us, and those things. In terms of stipulating that you must approach your business model in a particular way, that we're not prescriptive. And so in that, since that's a broader context within international licensees, and when you look at the report, you'd notice that banks differ in terms of how they distribute their ABMs across the island, right? We don't prescribe to say every DTI must provide ABMs in each parish. We don't do that. So I think whereas we could have prescribed timelines for each, I think we'd run into a bit of problem because the nuances of each DTI is different. And then you could then run into a situation where as a supervisor, you're basically holding one licensee to a particular standard that they can easily reach and holding another to a standard that you know they can't reach. And those are some of the nuances that we would have run into.
But quickly though, Doctor, I'm not suggesting for you to prescribe any business model. What I'm expecting to prescribe is a minimum service provision. Minimum service, not a business model. That's one. Number two, take your point about the varying capacity of each to adhere. And it's against the background of a transition into a standards arrangement where the absence of any. I wouldn't see that, I don't think the public would see it unreasonable if by virtue of size, range, a bank with 200 machines against one with 10, you said, okay, in respect of this provision, you will have X amount of time for compliance, which will vary from the other one, recognizing the varying situation with each. But at least the public knows what performance level to hold that particular institution to. Right now, everybody is cast in the 9 months, regardless of your size and capacity. So the ones who can do it quick don't have the real incentive to do it quick because they have 9 months. So against that background, I do believe that you need to revisit it within that context. We want to hold them accountable to the very same things that they voluntarily agreed to do. Because left on their own, they will not do it. And that's a track record. Don't agree?
Thank you, Member Jackson.